Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 5. A reminder, this channel is intended for half PPR. If you have any PPR or standard league specific questions, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. But let's bring up the position this week because, damn, it is decimated. Injuries are starting to pile up. We have 5 new players out this week. We got Malik Neighbors on IR, out for the year. Same with Tyreek Hill, out for the year. Cedric Tillman of the Browns was also placed on IR. That's interesting. In Cleveland, situation to monitor. And then in San Francisco, Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings, both top 2 receivers, are not going to play on Thursday night. Both ruled out already this week. So that's a lot of names off the list. We also already had injuries to CeeDee Lamb and Mike Evans. They're both out for a few weeks. Jalen McMillan also on IR in Tampa. Rashee Rice remains suspended in Kansas City. Brandon Ayuk is out in San Francisco. And Dyami Brown, I did not rank him because he did not play last week for the Jaguars. Jalen Coker is also on IR in Carolina. And then Jaden Reed and Christian Watson in Green Bay are not only out, but also on bye. So you also can't start Romeo Doubs, Matthew Golden, and Dontavian Wicks in Green Bay. There's also the Chicago Bears on bye. So Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, and Luther Burden also unavailable. And then Atlanta's on bye. Drake London and Darnell Mooney unranked as well. And lastly, the Steelers are on bye. So DK Metcalf and Calvin Austin are unranked as well. That's a lot of options that you just can't start, whether they're out from injury or buys. The position gets pretty thin once we exit the top 30. If you are getting picky this week, that means you have a very deep roster. Some teams are just going to have to roll with what they got. Some teams have very little depth, and it's going to show this week. So let's look into the matchups. I would like to chase touchdowns this season, and this chart on the screen here shows you not only how many points per game every defense is allowing, that's the blue stats in this chart, but in red, we have how many of those points are coming from touchdowns. I want to be chasing touchdowns. That's always a tiebreaker, especially in half PPR when you don't get that extra volume from reception. So because the bottom half of this chart is pretty isolated from the top, let us zoom in and focus only on touchdowns for the sake of this opening portion of the video. The order of teams is still ranked from most points allowed to fewest, and there are some trends we can pick up. If you allow at least 4 touchdowns on the season, that's 1 per game or more on average, then you are much more likely to be in the top half of the wide receiver matchups. Touchdowns move the needle significantly. Most of the teams giving up less than a touchdown per game, 3 or fewer, are on the right side of the chart, and those are the more difficult matchups you can find. So let's isolate the best touchdown odds this week at the receiver position. If you're going up against Dallas, they've given up 9 touchdowns in 4 games. That's more than 2 touchdowns per game. The Cowboys are terrible. Eberflus's defense is really vulnerable to opposing receivers. Then there's kind of a drop-off for the teams tied for second most touchdowns allowed. We have the Indianapolis Colts, the Baltimore Ravens, Chicago Bears, and Cleveland Browns, who have all given up 6 wide receiver touchdowns on the season. Relatively good odds that at least one receiver finds the end zone when they face off against those 4 teams. Then the odds are still slightly in your favor when it comes to Las Vegas, Tennessee, Washington, New Orleans, Buffalo, and Miami. They've all given up 5 receiver touchdowns on the year, and most of them do rank in the top half of this chart. Buffalo and Miami have been better at stopping yardage and overall catches, but still giving up more than a touchdown per game to opposing receivers on average. Then we have the league average, where 4 touchdowns, an average of 1 per game, is the standard. That's where most of the teams lie on this chart. We have the Giants, the Bengals, the Rams, the Jaguars, the Patriots, the Jets, Detroit, Green Bay, and Atlanta all have given up 4 touchdowns to receivers on the season. Then we're dropping mostly towards the tougher matchups. The Steelers, the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Bucks, and Carolina have only given up 3 touchdowns on the season. So odds are there's less than 1 per game to go around for their opposing wide receivers. So not the best matchups there, but it gets much more difficult with Arizona, Houston, San Francisco, Seattle, and Minnesota. They've only given up half a touchdown per game to the position, so that's a tougher spot. And then the most difficult teams to find the end zone against would be Denver and the LA Chargers. Those two teams only given up one receiver touchdown on the season. So obviously it's a bit matchup dependent. It will change as they face off against better or worse quarterbacks. But with 4 games of data, it's starting to at least be somewhat valuable to take a look at. Touchdowns are so important. I did want to bring this up before we moved on. So that's the touchdown production this season. And now let's just get back to overall, how many points per game are they usually giving up? Dallas is just way off the chart compared to everyone else. 42 points per game allowed by Dallas. Part of that is matchups, but part of that is just how terrible they are. They gave up 3 touchdowns to Romeo Doubs last week. So the Cowboys, if you have a receiver against them, has to be in your lineup. Garrett Wilson gets a major upgrade this week against the Cowboys. Then tier 2 is kind of a significant drop-off, but still all 5 of these next teams give up at least 32 points per game. We have the Colts, who did just get torched by Matthew Stafford. I don't know if it's that legit, but on paper, Jakobi Meyers and Tre Tucker get an upgrade. The Giants, also an upgrade for Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. The Raiders have been bad in the secondary, so Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, and Alec Pierce also get an upgrade. Baltimore has been bad this season, pretty injured as well this week, so Nico Collins, Christian Kirk, and Jaden Higgins may be more appealing. Tennessee also has been terrible. Their coaching is awful. Marvin Harrison Jr. looks like a much safer bet this week against the Titans. Then we have another drop-off for the next tier, and then these next 4 teams are all giving up at least 28 points per game this week. We have Cincinnati going up against Amon-Ra and Jameson Williams. Definitely start your Lions this week. And then Washington has been bad this season on defense. Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, and Ladd McConkey on paper deserve an upgrade. Then Pittsburgh is on bye, but the Rams are the next best matchup here. Ricky Pearsall, Juwan Jennings are inactive, so Demarcus Robinson and Kendrick Bourne are getting the on-paper upgrade in this spot. Lastly, Chicago also giving up 28 plus points. They are on bye this week. Irrelevant for fantasy purposes. When it comes to the downgrades, it's a little more obvious. There's kind of 2 tiers of bad matchups, and the bottom 6 are the main ones I'm worried about. Less than 20 points per game on average from these bottom 6 matchups. The Vikings have been the toughest spot this year, only 17.9 points per game. So Jerry Jeudy and Isaiah Bond, probably a tough spot for them, even with Tillman on IR. Seattle has also been a very tough matchup. So Emeka Egbuka and Chris Godwin also deserve a downgrade with Evans out. They're the 2 you're trusting. And then in Carolina, Waddle and Malik Washington are hard to trust, even with Tyreek Hill going down. The Panthers have been a tough matchup. The Niners have also been good on defense this year, so Puka and Adams technically get a downgrade, but they've been so good, I'm definitely not benching either of the Rams receivers. The Chargers have also been an elite defense this year, so Deebo and Terry McLaurin get a downgrade on paper. It looks like Terry probably going to play this week. Denver, as expected, is a terrible matchup, so A.J. Brown and Davante Smith are big gambles. Tampa Bay also has been tough on defense, so JSN, Cooper Kupp, and Torrey Horton, not the safest bet, but the Bucks could turn into a shootout. That is an interesting matchup there in terms of upside. Then there's one more tier. I'll bring up the next 3 difficult matchups. We have the Kansas City Chiefs, who are great at stopping number 1 receivers, so Brian Thomas Jr., Travis Hunter, not a good spot for them. We also have Houston, who has a great cornerback in the secondary, and Derek Stingley, so Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, harder to trust with Cooper Rush this week. And then the last one I will mention is Miami, who go up against Tetairoa McMillan and Hunter Renfrow. There's also Buffalo and Atlanta. The Bills get the Patriots, but haven't been locked down on defense this year, technically a downgrade. And then the Falcons are on bye. That is it in terms of matchups. So those are the charts I wanted to bring up in terms of upgrades and downgrades this week. But now with that out of the way, let's bring up my rankings. There's a lot of players out or on bye this week, so I don't think you can get too picky. And if you have some of the top options, it's pretty obvious you need to start them. So the top 2 is locked in. We got Puka Nacua and Amon-Ra St. Brown, same ranks as last week in this tier. no doubt about it. Puka is clearly the wide receiver 1 this year, 139 yards per game. He's a lock at number 1. And then Amon-Ra has 6 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Only 2 wide receivers are averaging over 20 points per game, and it's these 2 guys. There's kind of a big drop-off behind them in the rankings. So those 2 are locks in a tier of their own. And then at number 3, I think we just have to rank whichever wide receiver 1 is going up against Dallas at number 3. It's such a good matchup. They've allowed 9 touchdowns on the season, 42 points per game to the position. Garrett Wilson has to be in your lineup. He is a lock in this spot. No doubt about it. You're starting Garrett Wilson this week. I think you're also starting George Pickens no matter what until CeeDee Lamb returns. He's a lock in the lineup. Pretty big game from him last week. And honestly, I'm not that worried about Sauce Gardner this year. He's been pretty underwhelming. Justin Jefferson had his first 100-plus yard game last week with Carson Wentz against the Steelers. So now he's a very safe play. Obviously, you're starting Justin Jefferson. I think with Addison back on the field, that does open up the coverage a bit. There's another player to pay attention to, and I do think Jefferson will not get double teamed as much. Cleveland is a very good defense overall, but they're more elite against the run. I'm not that worried. They've also given up 6 receiver touchdowns in 4 games. I think Jefferson deserves a top 5 ranking, but the Browns do scare me just a little bit. Not enough to bench, though. Jefferson, still a lock in the lineup. At number 6, we got Davante Adams versus San Francisco, and he's pretty much a guarantee to score a touchdown. I think with their wounded opponent, the Niners, coming into town, I expect the Rams to put up as many points as possible. There's going to be mostly Niner fans at SoFi, and they want them to shut the fuck up. So Adams will score a touchdown, extremely high odds. I think Stafford is trying to set a new career record for Adams in terms of career high in touchdowns. I think if that was on Adams' resume, the most touchdowns came with Stafford. That would say a lot about Stafford versus Rodgers in terms of Hall of Fame consideration. I think that's an underrated rivalry to keep an eye out for. And Adams is averaging basically 2 end zone targets every week. Adams is one of the safest options you can find at receiver. The touchdown feels guaranteed. JSN also a pretty much locked into your lineup option, extremely safe production. One of only 4 receivers at the position averaging over 100 yards per game. So got to start him. I think the first half against the Cardinals is not a trend to bet on. He's going to look much more like that second half all throughout this game. There's also shootout potential versus Tampa Bay. With extra rest, I trust Darnold to get him the ball. JSN will be a top 10 play every week. But on paper, the Bucs are a bottom 10 matchup, so that's why I'm not ranking him above Jefferson or Adams. He's only moving down 2 spots because of this matchup. At number 8, we got Nico Collins at Baltimore, who does on paper get an upgrade. The Ravens defense has been really terrible this season. Marlon Humphrey is doubtful this week, so that's definitely not a matchup to worry about. I expect Nico Collins to eat, and as always, offer a very high floor. Even without a touchdown, you will get, just like last week, about 9.9, 10 points as a safety net. So expecting a lot from Nico this season. Definitely one of the least underwhelming round 1 wide receivers you could draft. Got to start him if you have him. At number 9, you also have to start Emeka Egbuka. Betting on Baker Mayfield's number 1 wide receiver is always a safe proposition. And although the matchup is terrible, it's the second worst against Seattle, I just don't think you can bench the Bucs wide receiver 1. It just feels like a bad omen to do that. So got to trust that touchdowns are destined for Egbuka. That's what's happened every game this season. And maybe he doesn't find the end zone off a 77-yard house call every week, but still, I trust Baker to get him the ball. I think Egbuka is a lock in the lineup. 10 targets last week. You have to trust it in Tampa. Number 10, I think you also have to trust Quentin Johnston versus Washington. It is an upgrade. On paper, the Commanders rank as a top 10 matchup. And it feels pretty dumb to keep benching Quentin Johnston at this point. If you've been doing it, you've missed out on a top 5 wide receiver. So have to keep lighting him up. If you watch the Chargers closely, they're looking to him as the number 1 read. He's actually really legitimately involved in this game plan. He's really talented. He's a nightmare to cover. It's just been the drops that have been the main problem for him throughout his career. And this year he's overly confident. It looks like that is well behind him. So he's a hard player to tackle. If he gets open, he can take it to the house from anywhere. He's got a lot of speed. He's a really good athlete. I think Quentin Johnston is a top 10 wide receiver against Washington this week. Ladd continues to struggle, and Keenan Allen at the age of 33 is a bit more of the old reliable option when they just need to move the chains. That's mainly when they're targeting Keenan Allen. They're designing plays for QJ. I think he's the wide receiver 1 in the Chargers offense this year. Right behind him, though, in the ranks, I do have Keenan Allen, who's been a lock in the lineup. Can't imagine you're benching him. He has a lot of touchdowns, and the connection with him and Herbert is just so good. The Commanders rank as a top 8 matchup this season, allowing just shy of 30 points per game on average. So I expect a touchdown for both QJ and Keenan pretty much every single week. I don't think Herbert throws multiple picks like he did last week, and I do trust this offense week in, week out. Start both Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen, both in my top 11 at the position. At number 12, even though we're in the third tier, this is the high-end wide receiver 2 market, and there's no way you're benching Deebo Samuel. Based on his production this season, the touchdowns feel very reliable to go to Deebo. And even though Terry McLaurin looks to be getting healthier, they're probably going to find themselves in a shootout in Los Angeles this week. So Deebo probably finds the end zone yet again. He's offering a pretty decent floor. 60 yards is the threshold before you get worried, and 63 yards per game from Deebo is perfectly fine. So I trust the touchdowns. I think he's earned must-start status, especially considering Jaden Daniels is healthy. He will play in this matchup against the Chargers. As long as Daniels is the quarterback, you got to start Deebo. He's a lock in the lineup. At number 13, I wanted to rank Courtland Sutton in the top 10. He's also earned must-start status, but he does get a downgrade in terms of matchups. The Eagles have a very good corner in Quinyon Mitchell, who can definitely lock you down. If not for that house call, Egbuka would have only had 3 catches on his 10 targets and not been a very safe play in fantasy last week. It required the 77-yard touchdown for Egbuka to have any value against Quinyon Mitchell last week. So there is some bust potential, but I've seen enough from Sutton over the years in Sean Payton's system to know that he's the safest bet to score a touchdown, and odds are Bo Nix does favor him a lot this week. It's probably going to turn into a shootout. I don't know if it's going to be a heavy defensive game against Philadelphia. You know the Eagles will force Denver to score a lot of points. So I think Sutton in this matchup is a must start. I'm not going to panic just because Quinyon Mitchell is opposite him. It's not ideal, but I'm not going to downgrade him outside the top 15. If you have Sutton based on the injuries and buys this week, I think you have to keep him in the lineup. Can't get picky with Courtland Sutton. I also think Ja'Marr Chase needs to be in your lineup this week. Still too talented, and the Patrick Surtain matchup is the main reason why I think he was so dog shit last week. Obviously, you're not encouraged with Jake Browning, but last year Browning was a lot more established and safer to bet on than he is this year, and maybe they're going to get fed up with him. Maybe they do trade for Jameis Winston, but they're giving him another shot. And against Detroit, I think there is some legit garbage time against a much weaker defense at home. I think Ja'Marr Chase will wake up. I think he'll look a lot more involved than he did last week. He was pretty fed up with his usage, pretty justifiably, and I think it was just the matchup. Surtain is a terrible spot to go up against. So the Lions are pretty decent on defense, but better against the run than the pass. And even if they lock him up in the first half, I think the garbage time will just inevitably showcase Ja'Marr Chase. They're going to send at least 11 targets his way. They have to. If they don't, what the fuck are they doing? It'd be pretty miserable if that's what happens. So I think Ja'Marr Chase will be fine from a floor standpoint. The Lions are also allowing about 1 touchdown per game this season on average, and I think that's going to go to Ja'Marr Chase. So without the touchdown, you might get burned, but I think it hits, and I think the yardage is going to be at least 65-70 this week against Detroit. They don't scare me anywhere near as much as the Broncos do. So I will keep him in the lineup, but can't feel good about it. I'm also going to start Chris Olave, but you can't feel good about it. He finally scores a touchdown in week 4. However, the volume falls off, and he still fails to go over 10 points. Pretty brutal game from Olave, considering it did include a touchdown. That was a big disappointment, even though it happened. So I don't expect a lot of touchdown for Chris Olave this season. I think a 25% rate is kind of what to bet on. I doubt he goes over 5 this year. However, the volume probably comes back to him, and this matchup against the Giants does rank top 3. So even though I'm not a fan of Olave on the season, I think in good matchups, you need to upgrade him. Given the state of the position, you can't get too picky, and based on the volume he's seen, I think you have to start him. The floor is too safe and reliable, and I think the touchdown odds are actually significantly higher this week against the Giants. They have allowed 5 touchdowns to receivers on the year. So it probably hits, but I think they give up enough yardage regardless where the floor is pretty high. Spencer Rattler has looked better than expected, and especially at home, I think the Saints have a legit chance to win this game. I think they will play well against the Giants' bad defense. So give me Chris Olave as a top 20 play this week. At number 15, I like the matchup enough to say you should be starting Olave. I rarely like him anywhere near this high. So start him while you can. The matchup suggests he's a safer bet in week 5. I also think Marvin Harrison Jr. is a much safer bet. Always a bit touchdown dependent. However, against Tennessee, it appears to be a good bet to make. They've allowed 5 touchdowns to the position this season, so Harrison is the most likely guy to find that touchdown. And even without it, the Titans have given up 32 points per game overall per week to opposing wide receivers. I think the yardage will be there, especially considering James Conner and Trey Benson are now on IR. The target share is just so consolidated. If it's not going to McBride, it has to go to Marvin Harrison Jr. Sometimes he doesn't wake up quick enough to really trust, but I think the volume is just going to be force-fed in his direction. I think he'll have to step up whether he wants to or not. I think he's a good wide receiver 2 in this matchup, but he always offers a little less than what you hope for. It's always a little disappointing. That's why I'm not going to rank him above Olave and Jamar Chase. I still haven't seen enough to feel like he is so locked in to top 12 production. It's not the safest bet, but odds are the Cardinals offense just has to send him targets. I think their hand is being forced, and Harrison should look similar to last week. He'll get the volume. He'll probably score a touchdown. I think he'll be fine as a wide receiver 2 in your lineup. I would start him against the Titans. It's been a good matchup this season. At number 17, I'm going to keep starting Michael Pittman Jr. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Daniel Jones continues to look legit, and Pittman scored a touchdown in a plus matchup last week. He gets another upgrade versus Las Vegas. They have been pretty vulnerable against the position top 4 matchup on the season. So keep him in the lineup. I don't think there's any reason to panic, and I would just stick with what's working. The Colts offense offers a lot of upside. At number 18, I think you're also going to keep starting Xavier Worthy, especially with Rashee Rice suspended. It's just a lock in the lineup, basically. He's back to the number 1 target in Kansas City now that he's back on the field. But he did not find the end zone last week. That was a minor red flag with Mahomes throwing for 4 touchdowns. You would have assumed it would happen. But Mahomes does spread it around, and opposing defenses are generally going to lock on and try to stop Worthy if they can. So I don't think the upside is elite. I could definitely see the Jags with a good defense this year keep him out of the end zone again. But last week he had 8 targets. If that's what you're getting from Mahomes, you got to trust it. Odds are he'll find the end zone sooner or later. So he has elite upside. You can't bench him. At wide receiver 18, maybe he's more of a floor play without the touchdown. I still think you're getting a top 20 performance out of Worthy. The floor is pretty safe in Kansas City with their top wideout. Got to start Worthy if you have him while Rashee is suspended. At 19, I think we're dropping down a tier, a little bit less safe of an option, but still really high upside, and I think worth a start as a low-end wide receiver 2 this week. Jameson Williams, I know, is a big boom-bust option this season, but when it hits, you can't pretend like it doesn't have the potential to win your matchup. He has such high upside, and the Bengals' defense is trash. I think Detroit is going to do whatever they want against Cincinnati. If you told me the score was 50-10 in this matchup, I wouldn't be shocked. On the road at Cincinnati, their defense won't have answers for Goff and the offense. But the Bengals are much worse against the run. That is the only problem here. Maybe the volume continues to be too low for JMO to contribute, but all he needs is one big play, and I think it's going to click this week. The Bengals are just so uninspiring on defense. I can't downgrade JMO. I have to give him an upgrade. It is a top 10 matchup after all. I think Jameson Williams has too much upside to bench given all the players unavailable in week 5. I think he's a top 20 option this week. At number 20, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you want to start Stefon Diggs in his revenge game at Buffalo in prime time. You know he'll be asking for the ball. They're probably going to focus on stopping him a little extra on defense, but that feels kind of stupid. There's a lot of randomness in the Patriots offense, and it's kind of just death by 1,000 cuts. If you focus too much on Diggs, it will not work out. So I think they'll have their hands full. The Bills defense also hasn't looked impressive this season other than the Jets game. And last week, Diggs did go over 100 yards receiving. So I think there's also very good odds he finds the end zone. You know he wants one, and it feels like a good narrative, a good opportunity in front of the national audience. Give Diggs that touchdown, let him gloat a little bit against his former team. I think that's one of the reasons they signed him, why he wanted to go to New England. Gets 2 matchups every year against the Bills, and I think he's earned number 1 receiver status for Drake May. I think he's the safest bet other than Hunter Henry in this passing game. I think Diggs has a very good game against the Bills. If it's not a shootout, there's at least garbage time to hope for. I think the upside's very high on Stefon Diggs this week. If he goes over 100 yards just like in week 4, then he might crack 20 points. I think the touchdown will hit for Diggs against the Bills. At 21, I got Tetairoa McMillan versus Miami, and the touchdown is really the only problem for Tet. There's not that many to bet on in Carolina. But although the Dolphins are a bottom 10 matchup on paper against wide receivers, they've also allowed 5 touchdowns to the receiver position on the year. So that means there is, in all likelihood, a touchdown available for a Panthers receiver. And if you're going to bet on one, I think it should be Tetairoa McMillan. A minimum of 8 targets per game means the floor is very safe. And if he does find pay dirt, then he has that 15 plus point ceiling we are hoping for. So I think he gives you at least 9 points guaranteed. Maybe you're more fearful of Miami, but I am not. And I think Tet is a very good play against the Dolphins. They're playing at home. I think they step up. And given the injuries in their receiving core, it's not a guarantee that Leggett comes back to the field. I think Bryce Young has to trust him. I think Tet has a very safe floor in this matchup. A high-end flex play, low-end wide receiver 2 against the Dolphins in week 5. At 22, in the same game, I have Jaylen Waddle at Carolina. And obviously losing Tyreek Hill cements Waddle as basically a must-start in your lineup. But the Panthers have had a very good secondary this season. It's a bottom 3 matchup against the receiver position this year. And on a short week on the road, he's not my favorite play to lock into the top 12. But even though I'm downgrading him, he's still a top 25 option. I would like to see what this offense looks like without Tyreek Hill. I doubt that Waller is going to vulture every single touchdown. But against J.C. Horn, there's a chance that Waddle does get locked up. Horn is a very legit corner to worry about. So it's mainly just the matchup that I'm worried about. I did downgrade him about 7 or 8 spots because of it. He would have been top 15 if not for the Panthers. So this week he's just a low-end wide receiver 2. I would still start him. Without Tyreek Hill, the volume should be locked in for Tua. He's definitely going to be the number 1 target in Miami. Waddle has a lot of upside rest of season, and I was hoping that Tyreek Hill got traded when it came to Waddle's value this year. That's basically what happened. The only benefit is they didn't acquire a new receiver to challenge him for targets. So Waddle, clearly the number 1 target in Miami. That stands for something definitely valuable this week with all the players on bye and injured. Waddle's a clear top 25 option against Carolina, even though the matchup is bad. At 23, I have Terry McLaurin at the Chargers, who is technically questionable, but all of the reports indicate he's trending in the right direction. He didn't play last week, but it looks like as Jaden Daniels returns to the field, odds are Terry will play as well on the road at the Chargers. Chargers have a very good offense, so they need all the help they can get. Their defense has not looked very good this season. So I think Herbert will light up the scoreboard. The Commanders will have to score points as well. So I think the rest is going to help Terry McLaurin. He's had a weird off season that also included some injuries. I think sitting out was a good moment for him to recuperate and catch his breath. I think he'll look better coming back to the offense in week 5. He's been terrible up to this point, but I think rust was a major factor. The offseason holdout plus the ankle injury, not a lot of reps in practice, and I think he'll look much better stepping up against the Chargers. So even though they have a very good defense, not giving up many touchdowns, I think there's a lot of upside against LA in a potential shootout. If I had Terry McLaurin, I would just start him. I think he's a safe flex play this week against the Chargers. And at 24 and 25, if I have either of the Eagles receivers, I think I have to start them as well, even though I'm really worried about the Eagles passing game, especially given Goddard has been such a big factor there. Given all the options on bye and injured, you just have to plug them into the lineup. You can't be too picky about it. It's obviously a bad matchup against Denver. A.J. Brown is not my preferred play against Pat Surtain. I'd rather go Davante Smith. But at some point, the Broncos probably force their hand. As long as the Eagles are forced to throw, there's always elite upside for Davante and A.J. Brown. They can always score a deep touchdown. They usually get big volume when the Eagles have to throw it, but there's always the chance that their defense steps up and they just control the clock and run it all game long. There are a lot of moments this year where A.J. Brown and Davante have disappeared because the volume's just not there. There's always a lot of risk. This season, with the new offensive coordinator, it's looked pretty brutal. So you can't feel good about it, but I think you just have to keep trusting it. At some point, I think it will get fixed. The upside's too high, but damn, the floor is just non-existent. If you get less than 3 points from either guy, you're not going to be shocked, especially with A.J. Brown against Pat Surtain. Yikes. Can't imagine you feel good about it. But he can always break open a big play. There's always still some matchup-proof route running from Brown and even Davante. There is still some upside, but the floor is just so low. They are just flex plays this week against the Broncos. We saw how bad the Bengals receivers were against Denver. It's possible it happens again this week, but I obviously trust Hurts a lot more than Browning. Good luck. You're going to need it. I think you have to start him if you have him. Then moving forward, outside the top 25, I think we are in the clear flex discussion. And although some of these guys have high floors, not always the safest bet for touchdowns, and then some of them have no floor at all, but also offer big play potential, could turn into a house call touchdown at any time. When it comes to Jakobi Meyers, though, I'm just betting on the floor. It is a decent matchup on paper, though, against the Colts. It does rank top 2, but last week they got completely demolished by Matthew Stafford, Puka, Adams, and even Tutu Atwell just torched them. I think it's a bit misleading to consider the Colts as a number 2 matchup for the position. Charvarius Ward can definitely step up and lock up Jakobi Meyers, who has been disappointing despite the volume in the first 2 weeks. It has fallen off, and all the upside has gone to Tre Tucker in this offense. Last week, Genty hogged it all to himself. So he is the number 2 target behind Brock Bowers, but as the tight end gets healthier, it's more discouraging for Meyers' upside. And I've just been too underwhelmed the last few weeks. He has potential, but he's just not living up to it. My patience is starting to run out. So Jakobi moving down the list, if there weren't as many buys, I think he'd barely rank in the top 35. And it's really just because of all the injuries why he's still in the top 30. But not a very safe play, just a floor option. And if he does find the end zone, you'll be happy. But if not, you're probably not going over 10 points. It's been pretty underwhelming the last 2 games, but I will mention the Colts have allowed 6 wide receiver touchdowns this year. There are some decent odds that Meyers can find the end zone. I'm hoping for it, but I don't think it's the safest bet to make. I'd rather go A.J. Brown against Pat Surtain, and that's saying a lot. A.J. Brown is not safe at all. I just think he has much higher upside than Jakobi Meyers. I also think Shakir is kind of lacking in the upside department, very touchdown dependent to go over 10 points, but it looks like he's back to stepping in to wide receiver 1 in Buffalo. It appears that his chemistry from last season is still relied upon by Josh Allen, but the matchup against New England does pose one problem. If he lines up against Christian Gonzalez, then that's a big downgrade, but based on where Gonzalez lines up and the fact that Shakir is more of a slot receiver, I think Keon Coleman is going to get the major downgrade from Gonzalez in terms of matchup. So I'm not worried about the shadow coverage too much. I think it's always a decent shot for a touchdown in Buffalo. Betting on Josh Allen, not a bad bet to make. So let's hope for that touchdown even without it. I think Shakir offers a relatively high floor. I'll start him given the state of the position. I think he's a top 30 play in week 5. I also think Chris Godwin is a top 30 option as well. Not a good matchup versus Seattle, so definitely deserves a downgrade, but it was a downgrade versus Philly as well, and he did see 10 targets in his return to the field in week 4. So betting on him to be elite off the ankle injury is not the safest bet, but given Evans is out, Baker should continue to send him a lot of targets, and it looks like Kate Otten didn't step up last week. I'm trusting Godwin as the number 2 target for Baker, and that's always valuable. That's always a high chance for a touchdown, so always a good bet in Tampa. And if not for Seattle, I would probably rank him top 20. I think I'd probably rather go Godwin than someone like JMO if it wasn't against the Seahawks. But it is the second toughest matchup overall, so have to be a little concerned. Devon Witherspoon will line up in the slot opposite him. That is not an easy spot for Godwin coming off the injury. So not expecting an elite performance, but the volume should carry you. If he scores a touchdown, don't be surprised at all. Number 29, we have Jordan Addison versus Cleveland. The Browns have a very good defense, so not convinced they give up a big play like the Steelers did last week, but they're always going to take their shots to Addison downfield in Minnesota. So always an interesting bet, very high upside, but pretty low floor. If he burns you, I wouldn't be shocked. I'm not expecting Carson Wentz to throw for 350 yards every week. Against the Browns, I think it's more of a defensive, low-scoring game. So only going to trust Jefferson as a must-start. Addison, I think, is just in the flex conversation. The Browns, I think, are still a red flag in terms of matchups. They have given up some touchdowns, but not that many yards. They're more elite against the run, however. If there's one spot they're more vulnerable, it would be in the secondary. Maybe Addison does pop off for over 100 yards, but in general, that's not something to bet on in Minnesota from the wide receiver 2. Addison probably falls back down to earth in this matchup. A little bust potential, but also very high ceiling. Worth the swing if you need one. At 30, Zay Flowers is still probably worth a swing as a top 30 option, but with the downgrade to Cooper Rush, I'm not as inspired as I was with Lamar Jackson. He's still their number 1 target for sure. However, against the Texans, we have Derek Stingley, a very good corner to worry about. So that's a big downgrade, not a good matchup at all here. And Flowers definitely offers major bust potential. Stingley could be a major problem, and I could see a lack of targets for Flowers. When he has a bad game, he is dog shit. So major bust potential against the Texans, but if he does manage to get over 7 targets, as long as it's 8 or more, then the production from Flowers has been very consistent. Over the last 2 years, the magic number for him is 8 targets. We'll see if Cooper Rush favors him that much, despite the bad matchup. I'm worried. I want to see what this offense looks like before I lock in Flowers to the lineup. Even though he has elite upside, can give you 25 points any week, he can also give you less than 5. If he gives you less than 30 yards, you would not be surprised at all. He's a major boom bust option, remains a red flag, especially with a worse quarterback situation and terrible matchup against Derek Stingley. Not my favorite play, but maybe you're desperate enough where you have no choice but to start him. I also think you probably have no choice but to start Brian Thomas Jr. versus the Chiefs, but if you can bench him, I don't think this is the matchup to chase. Historically, under Andy Reid and Spags' defense, the Chiefs have been elite at stopping number 1 wide receivers. All you have to do is look to week 3 against Malik Nabers to see that that is the case. Nabers had a terrible game after he put up 2 touchdowns and like 30 points on Dallas. It was a major fall from grace for Nabers. And I haven't seen enough consistency in Jacksonville this year to trust Brian Thomas to be matchup proof. Definitely a major red flag based on his production this season. I think it's Shane Waldron, the wide receiver coach in Jacksonville, is not a benefit to the passing game at all. But with an extra day of prep time, maybe Trevor Lawrence and BTJ establish a better connection. I'm very worried about it though. In general, I just want to fade top receivers against the Chiefs. It's such a difficult matchup in general. And on the season, it does rank bottom 10 against the position. They've only allowed 3 receiver touchdowns on the season. It's not a guarantee that any receiver will find the end zone this week on Monday. So not excited about it. I think we need to keep having patience with BTJ. I think he'll look better. This is mainly a terrible matchup, and I do want to bench him if I can. But maybe you can't be picky. Maybe you have to. I get it if you're hand is forced. Good luck with Brian Thomas Jr. I do not think this is the week to feel confident about a bounce back. I would consider buying low, but against the Chiefs, I think the price is going to get even lower after week 5. I think he'll look even worse against the Chiefs. At 32, Ladd McConkey has also looked terrible this season, so can't have much patience with him. You got to trust QJ and Keenan a lot more, and I'm done ranking Ladd in the top 20, but it's possible that he bounces back in a major way. Once we discount him entirely, odds are he will look phenomenal, just like last year. So I don't want to completely get burned, but you've lost a lot of confidence here, and against the Commanders, how many targets are really going to go his way? There's a crowded offense overall, and with their injuries on the O-line, you can't feel good about Herbert having time to throw it. It's possible he has a rough day, just like he did versus the Giants on the road last week, but I think at home they should look fine. Ladd is just not the safest play. At some point he will bounce back, but until he does, I don't see how you can argue for him to be ranked top 25. It just doesn't make sense based on the production this season. He has been dog shit, been a very bad start. Last week, it was fucking brutal. So not excited here. I think just like BTJ, you're pressing your luck if you trust him. Not a safe option at all. It's pretty sad and unfortunate, but it is what it is. At 33, the last player I think is worth a legitimate flex consideration would be Troy Franklin at Philadelphia. This game is either all defense or will quickly turn into a shootout, and I think it's more likely that the Broncos try and score as many points as possible and take their shots down the field. Got to be sharp for all 4 quarters, and Quinyon Mitchell will probably hold Sutton back a few times. There's going to be some necessity for somebody else to step up, and Franklin is operating as the number 2 receiver, so he has very high upside. I think there could be 9 targets for him this week. I see a lot of volume headed his way, and one of those could break for a very big touchdown. He has very high upside in this matchup, could be relied upon very much. So I'm not worried about him too much, but it's hard to, on paper, rank him above Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, guys like Flowers and Godwin. At 33, I think he could be at the top of this tier, honestly, but I just don't think I'm that excited to put him 7 spots higher. It's probably safer to keep him behind Brian Thomas and Ladd, but he's very valuable. I think he's at least worth a roster spot. I think this is a good matchup for him, given Sutton deserves a downgrade against Quinyon Mitchell. There is some upside against the Eagles, no doubt about it. Beyond this point, though, I think I'm trying to bench these players. If I could start a top 25 running back, I would rather do that. However, you may be desperate enough where you have to look elsewhere. At 34, I got WanDale Robinson at New Orleans, the new number 1 wide receiver in New York. For the Giants, that's definitely somewhat valuable, but the Saints, I'm not sure, offer like the best matchup possible. It's pretty average this season, so not an upgrade or downgrade. And I haven't seen enough in the passing game from Jackson Dart to feel inspired that WanDale is going to get 10 plus targets. Last week, Dart was mostly impressive in the scrambling department. That's what kept them afloat throughout the game, that and the run game with Cam Scatterboo. So I don't fully expect WanDale's role to change, even though Neighbors is gone and you would expect more targets. I just don't know exactly what I'm getting from the Giants passing game without Neighbors on the field. So I'd rather wait 1 week before I start endorsing WanDale as a must start. At wide receiver 34, though, in general, he's offered a very safe floor the last couple seasons, and that's probably a still safe bet to make. I would expect at least 7 or 8 points from WanDale, and if he finds the end zone, you'll be ecstatic about starting him. But don't feel safe to bet on that. It's a hard trust factor to feel safe with. I just don't think he's the highest upside swing you can find. Just a floor play still in week 5, even without Neighbors. I don't think his ceiling goes up that much. With Dart, I don't know what I'm getting yet. At 35, Keon Coleman probably draws the Christian Gonzalez matchup, so I think he does get a downgrade. But there's always upside in Buffalo, always touchdown potential. Play him at your own risk, but if it's not going to hit, you know he'll probably bust for less than 5 points. You're either getting 15 plus or less than 5. Hopefully it works out, but if I don't have to, I would rather bench Keon Coleman. I'd also rather bench Rashid Shaheed, but on paper, the matchup against the Giants does rank top 3, so maybe it's going to be a good week for him. Maybe there's a touchdown that doesn't go to Olave, but Juwan Johnson is definitely above him in terms of the target share, and if he's the third option for Rattler, that's not the safest bet in general. So not the most excited to start Shaheed, but the matchup suggests if there's ever a week to bump him up the rankings, it would be in this spot. Interesting option, but low-end flex potential, very touchdown dependent, need a big play, and if it doesn't happen, you will get burned. So boom bust, just like Keon Coleman, and same goes for T. Higgins. If he does not find the end zone, you will get screwed with T. Higgins. But in general, Jake Browning does look to him in the end zone. The vibes are just so bad in Cincinnati, it's hard to imagine a lot of production from the Bengals offense. But against Detroit, I think if there's one thing you can bet on, it's a lot of garbage time will be a factor. So they are going to throw it a lot in the second half. I expect them at home to wake up a little bit on offense, but I don't think Jake Browning has given you enough confidence to feel safe starting any Bengals receiver. I did rank Jamar top 15 this week, but even that feels like a big gamble. So not going to trust the number 2 receiver. If it's not Jamar Chase, I don't think I'm starting a single Bengals option in fantasy this week. It's a little too touchdown dependent, and I doubt there's many touchdowns in Cincinnati in the first place. Good luck. If you have to start him, you probably lose with T. Higgins. At 38, it's a major gamble on Tre Tucker. The volume fell off a cliff last week, but on paper, it is a good matchup for the Vegas receivers against the Colts. They gave up a shit ton of yards to Stafford and the Rams, but I don't know if Geno will capitalize in the same way. So I am still of the mindset that the only safe receiver to start in Las Vegas would be Jakobi Meyers, but Tre Tucker does offer that elite upside that we saw in week 3. I doubt he ever puts up more than 1 touchdown in a game, though. That's pretty hard to expect. So on the season, he's been okay, a major boom bust option, but 22 total targets and 4 rush attempts. They do use him a decent amount, at least 6 opportunities per week on average. That is somewhat valuable in a plus matchup. Maybe you do think Tre Tucker offers some upside. He's in my top 40, so you could do much worse, but I think I'd rather pass if I could. At 39 and 40, I have the 2 Cleveland Browns receivers, Jerry Jeudy and Isaiah Bond, and I just don't really know what to expect with the new quarterback, Dylan Gabriel, under center. They're traveling to London. It'll be an interesting game here against Carson Wentz, and the Vikings are the worst matchup on paper. They give up less than 18 points per game to the position, and I really don't know what you're getting from either option. I don't think there's many touchdowns to go around. On the season, there's only been 2 for receivers against Minnesota. So what is this offense under Gabriel? I do not know. I am worried about both Browns receivers, and Tillman does go on IR, so I do upgrade Bond right behind Jeudy. I think it's really just a bet on who finds the end zone. I think the overall target share in Cleveland is usually pretty spread out and even. So I do rank Jeudy above Isaiah Bond, but Bond has actually looked pretty decent. It wouldn't shock me entirely if Bond finds the end zone. That's what was happening with Tillman. Jeudy was not the end zone target, even though he was listed as the top receiver on the depth chart. It's a pretty random distribution in Cleveland. So need a touchdown. I doubt it happens against the Vikings. A tough matchup, one I'd rather fade. I'm going to keep both of them on the bench. But with Tillman on IR, I do think Bond is possibly worth a pickup. At wide receiver 40, he's not as safe given all the buys this week and injuries, but he is a factor. If you are rostering Tillman, there's an argument that Bond is equally as valuable as he was. So in the top 40, there is some argument to be made why you should start them, but this week I'm not going to trust either Browns receiver. Let's see who Gabriel favors before we lock one of them in the lineup. At 41, I got Travis Hunter versus the Chiefs, and the Chiefs lock up number 1 receivers very well. This game is in prime time, and it's one of their few showcase opportunities for the national audience all year. If he sucks, then the conversation is going to pivot to him being a bust, and the new GM definitely doesn't want that to be the conversation. So if there's someone that's motivated to get Travis Hunter the ball, it is the general manager. Will his voice be heard by Liam Cohen? I have no idea, but there's obviously an opportunity for Hunter if De'Ami Brown remains off the field. I just haven't seen enough to trust him. Maybe he's due for a breakout game, but based on their usage for him, it just hasn't worked. They need to change something because him factoring in as a corner and receiver, it just isn't good enough. It's just not what we expected at all. He was advertised as a much better player than what he's shown so far. So I think this is the make or break week. If he does not step up in a matchup that really limits number one wideouts. Where the fuck is he ever going to step up after this point? I'm really considering dropping Travis Hunter. I have him on one of my teams, but this is the last week I'll have any patience. If he doesn't get the commitment from Lawrence this week in the targets, I will never feel comfortable starting him the rest of the season. I think it's a really big red flag based on his production this season. I'd rather fade Hunter, but maybe you're so desperate where you have to start him. I am kind of in that situation on a team where I have CeeDee Lamb on IR and London on bye. I think I have to start Hunter in my lineup, unfortunately. At 42, I have Elic Ayomanor at Arizona. He's looking like the most valuable Titans wide receiver so far, thanks to touchdowns. And without it, you will get screwed. So very touchdown dependent, but he has been the safest bet there. The Cardinals are actually a very bad matchup so far. They've only given up 2 receiver touchdowns on the season. And if Will Johnson is healthy, I'd be pretty terrified to start a Titans receiver against him. So I do think Ayomanor is the guy you want, but only because Ridley is not practicing. It looks like Ridley got injured last week. They scaled back his snap share, and if he doesn't go on Sunday, then Ayomanor will operate as the top target. But the matchup's not good. I could see Okonkwo outperform him. I have not seen enough from Tennessee to expect any touchdowns from the Titans. So not a good play, not safe at all, but I would rather go Ayomanor this week than Calvin Ridley. I have Ridley in a tier below of Ayomanor, and it's not a safe bet for him to play at all. He's not practicing so far. His snaps were limited last week. I think he will probably miss some time, most likely. So monitor his reps throughout the week. It's possible he's ruled out by Friday. And even if he plays, it is probable that Will Johnson, their rookie corner, does suit up. And if that's the case, the schedule just continues to be brutal. Ridley would get a major downgrade in that situation. I don't think he's healthy. He's looked terrible. Can't feel good starting him, despite his status as the top target in Tennessee. It's just not safe enough. So far, he's been bad. At 44, Marvin Mims at Philly definitely has some upside, but needs a touchdown, needs some deep passes, and if they don't click, you will get burned. I'd rather go Franklin, but Mims has equally high upside. He was a great play last week against the Bengals, but it's always a gamble. If it's not Sutton, I think I'd rather just trust Franklin opposed to Mims. At 45, I got Darius Slayton at New Orleans, who I think is worth a pickup. I'm kind of weary of Jackson Dart as a passer. The rookie quarterback has not proven enough yet. But I will acknowledge last year when Neighbors had a concussion for 2 games, WanDale did not step in as the number 1 target. It was actually Slayton who had 11 targets per game filling in for Neighbors. So it's possible he's actually the guy you want. Possible rest of season, he has that elite upside. But until I know what I'm getting from Dart, I'm only going to start WanDale if I have the option in the Giants receiving core. I just don't feel safe enough to bet on multiple guys. Dart is not established enough to know what you're going to get. So too many variables, not a safe play at all. I think I'll pass on Slayton, but I will pick him up off the wire. There is some very high upside. He's potentially the number 1 target in the Giants offense moving forward. It's not crazy. I wouldn't rule that out as a possibility. At 46, I think Alec Pierce is actually more interesting as the number 2 receiver in Indianapolis for fantasy purposes. Last week he didn't play with a concussion, but I think he'll come back to the field. And last week, A.D. Mitchell filled in for him, almost had a deep touchdown. If not for the fumble at the goal line, then A.D. Mitchell would have been elite in fantasy last week. So Pierce, I think, retains that role. He has 5 targets, 4 catches, and 67 yards in back-to-back games before the concussion. And I think he's the number 2 fantasy receiver in Indianapolis. I haven't seen enough from Downs to question that. So I think it's a good spot, a good matchup versus Las Vegas. Very boom bust with Pierce, but I think against the Raiders, it's an interesting matchup where you could talk yourself into it. I think there is legit upside with Pierce. Needs a big play, but definitely could happen from Daniel Jones. At 47 and 48, I don't know what to make of the Niners receiving core, but I have Demarcus Robinson and Kendrick Bourne back-to-back on Thursday at the Rams. And Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings have been ruled out. So is Kittle, so is Ayuk, and so is Purdy. So these 2 guys will be the top 2 targets for Mac Jones. And how much do you trust Kyle Shanahan? The offense should still be somewhat viable, even without all the starters. So maybe there's a touchdown here. That's why I do rank Demarcus Robinson above Kendrick Bourne if I was going to bet on one guy to find the end zone, it would be DeMarcus, only because it's a revenge game for him, and maybe Shanahan wants to rub it in McVay's face. I can score touchdowns with DeMarcus as well. So it's pretty random, hard to bet on. Last week, neither guy had more than 30 yards. It's pretty brutal, but someone has to get the targets other than McCaffrey in San Francisco. The Rams don't have the best secondary. It could be a very underrated opportunity to start one of these Niners receivers. There's a chance, but I'd probably only take it in DFS. Very much a gamble in season long. Not going to press my luck if I don't have to. At 49, I like the upside for Torrey Horton versus the Bucs this week. I think Seattle needs some big plays and shots down the field to keep up with Tampa. And I think against Baker, it can always turn into a heavy shootout. I trust the upside more for Horton compared to Cooper Kupp. Horton has 3 touchdowns on the year and is just more explosive, more dynamic. I think I'd rather take my shot. There's more bust potential with Horton, but not by much. I think the ceiling's much higher than Kupp. I'd rather go Horton as the number 2 option in Seattle than Cooper Kupp. Top 50 option at receiver this week. At 50, we have Jalen Tolbert at the Jets, who did have 6 targets for the Cowboys last week. It's next man up with no CeeDee Lamb. And Tolbert isn't a safe bet, but if someone other than Pickens has to get targets, it would be him. I think he is the number 2 receiver behind Pickens and also behind Jake Ferguson. There's touchdown upside, no doubt about it. But that's really the last guy I think I would start in my lineup with some confidence for like really high upside. Beyond this point, it's a major gamble, and I'll just rip through the next 10 players just for the sake of always ranking 60 receivers. I have Hollywood Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster of the Chiefs at 51-52. Need a touchdown. Mahomes spreads it around. Good luck knowing where it's going to go. I'd rather go Hollywood than Juju, but it could easily be Tyquan Thornton and burn you. 53, we got Rashad Bateman versus Houston. Flowers gets a bad matchup, but trusting Cooper Rush is a big gamble. I don't know what to make of the Ravens offense this week, so no thanks with Rashad. Leggett comes back to the field. Miami has been somewhat vulnerable at receiver touchdowns, so maybe it works out, but not a safe play at all. I only trust Tet in Carolina. And then Josh Downs, I don't think is as valuable as Alec Pierce, but still factoring in a bit. Has not looked the same this year at all, though. Christian Kirk does get targets, but Jaden Higgins had the touchdown last week, so Kirk, a big gamble, even in a good matchup on paper versus the Ravens. Kupp, not my favorite bet. Not much of a floor, and I think Horton has higher upside, so I would probably drop Kupp if he doesn't have a good game this week, if you haven't done it already. Malik Washington probably steps up with no Tyreek Hill, but until I see some consistency out of him, I'm not going to start him. I think Waller might rank above him for targets. And then lastly, that Bills-Patriots game has some really high upside. I think Demario Douglas and Kayshon Boutte could find their way into the end zone, but very risky gamble. They haven't had enough volume the last few weeks. Since week 1, they've kind of fallen off. So those are my rankings this week, the top 60 at the position. And overall, I think based on all the injuries and buys this week, if you have anyone in the top 25, just start them and accept your fate. Even if you're not that inspired, even if there's a lot of risk, you can't get too picky about the position. I think the top 10 are clearly locked into the lineup. We've seen enough from them, if not just draft capital that forces them into your lineup. And then the top 18, I think, are the very high-end number 2 receivers. I think odds are they're in the lineup. Very unlikely you have enough depth to bench anyone in the top 18. But starting with JMO through AJ Brown, the low-end wide receiver 2s, there is some risk factored in. There's always some bust potential with all these players. They've not been consistent enough this season, but I also think they have very high ceilings in these matchups. There's always some high touchdown production for guys like Diggs in a revenge spot. Tet might get his first touchdown this week. Waddle obviously gets more volume without Tyreek Hill. And then Davante and AJ Brown, good luck predicting that. But same upside as someone like Jameson Williams and Terry, could always score a deep touchdown from anywhere on the field. Beyond the top 25, though, I think there are only limited flex options. Only inside the top 33 would I feel safe to start them. And I'm mainly trusting the floor that comes with volume for guys like Jakobi, Khalil Shakir, Godwin, Addison, Flowers, BTJ, Ladd, and Troy Franklin. There's some major bust potential with all these guys, but the upside still remains high enough where you can start them with some confidence. But I don't know what I'm getting from Jackson Dart, so starting with WanDale Robinson, I think I'd rather start benching them. But in the top 42, you could do a lot worse. WanDale, Keon Coleman, Rashid Shaheed, T. Higgins, Tre Tucker, the The two Browns receivers, Hunter and Ayomanor, are very touchdown dependent. Without it, you will not go over 10 points, in my opinion. But starting with Ridley, I think at that point you should definitely bench everyone. Ridley might not even play. Mims is too touchdown dependent. Really boom bust with him. Same goes for Slayton and Alec Pierce. The Niners receiving core is a major gamble. And then if you don't get a touchdown from Horton or Tolbert, what are you going to get at all? Outside the top 50, I would not start them. But consider rostering them if you are so desperate this week. You need someone off the wire. Those are my preferred options off of the waiver wire if you need them. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. My name's Adam Riancho. I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.